Hi, in this tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at the Blendrónic preparation for bitKlavier. To begin, let's add a Blendrónic preparation to our creation site. Let's right-click, add, here we are. In order to start using the Blendrónic preparation, we have to connect it to one of the other core preparations, such as the direct preparation, the nostalgic preparation, and the synchronic preparations. If we don't do this, we won't be able to hear the effect of the Blendrónic preparation on the audio. So let's command click and drag the connection here. Before diving into each parameter, let's reset each one. This will make it easier to understand what's going on. Let's set this to 1. Set the delay length value to 1 as well. Let's set the smoothing rate to 0. And let's set the feedback coefficient to 0 as well. And all I'm doing is double clicking on the value and then typing in these particular numbers. Blendrónic has 4 main parameters: beat length, delay length, smoothing, and feedback. And each of these parameters can be sequenced over 16 equal steps. Though each parameter is fairly straightforward, experimenting with 2 or more in conjunction with one another can produce some pretty interesting yet unpredictable results, so keep that in mind when working with this preparation. First, let's take a look at the delay length parameter. The delay length parameter controls the length of the delay effect, but what is delay? Delay is an effect that records a sound into a recording buffer and plays it back after an amount of time determined by the delay length value. Another way to think about it is like a photocopier, where you can control the speed of the copies coming out of the photocopier. But instead of paper, delay takes sound and makes a copy of that and then plays that back after a given amount of time. To hear what this sounds like, let's play something on the keyboard. As you can hear, after we played a note, you could hear the note repeated after a small amount of time. Now, if we increase the delay length, it'll take longer for us to hear this initial sound repeated. And if we decrease the delay length, it'll take us less time. Already, we can get some pretty cool textures and patterns by only manipulating this value. However, using the sequencer, we can make things even more interesting, and it allows us for more movement and change in what we hear. So let's mess with this for a little bit. Let's set this to 2, 1, 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, 0.2. That's good for right now. And I'm going to increase the feedback coefficient, but we'll get to what that does later. Let's play some notes and see what happens. Now let's move on to the smoothing parameter. Beat length controls how long it takes until the delay shifts from one to the next, whereas the smoothing parameter controls how long the delay takes to fully shift. When the value is low, the shift will be instantaneous. When the value is high, the shift will be smoothed over a given amount of time in milliseconds. This may be hard to understand now, so let's mess with the parameters to hear what's going on. So I'm going to play a chord, and let's set the smoothing value to 2000 just to start. In that example, you can hear the pitch shifting as the delay shifts, and that is because the smoothing rate is at a higher value. It's not at 0 anymore, it's at 2000 milliseconds. If we decrease the value of the smoothing rate, let's move it down to 200 instead, we hear higher pitches. If we move it down even lower to 2, we hear very quick and high-pitched clicking sounds. That's because, one, it's taking an almost instantaneous amount of time for the delays to shift, but not so quick that we can't hear a slight pitch change that is basically, since it's going so fast, it comes, or it's what's the word? It sounds like clicking instead of like an audible pitch. If we set the value to something higher, like 500 or 5,000, it's much more of a unstable pitch bend like effect. So this is something that you can use when you're trying to mess with pitch effects in Blendrónic, and instead of using potentially different tunings and sort of the tuning preparation, you can do some more wild and unpredictable things if you use the smoothing effect or smoothing parameter in Blendrónic. Finally, let's look at the feedback coefficient parameter. The feedback coefficient value determines how many times the initial audio is repeated. If you set the feedback coefficient to a high value, you'll hear more repeats. If you set the feedback coefficient to a low value, you'll hear less repeats. As the feedback coefficient gets close to and past 1, or 1.00, the delay will start to self-oscillate. And this means that the delay is starting to act upon itself, repeating the repeated audio over and over again, and things will start to get a bit out of control. This may be what you want, but it's important to note that once the delay starts to self-oscillate, there's not much you can do about things except turning the feedback back down. Let's work with this parameter and listen to what happens. Now I'm going to set the smoothing back to 0 and just turn up the feedback to, let's start with 50. Or actually 0.50 since it's a coefficient. So we can hear the delays start to trail off, or the repeated notes, the repeated audio start to trail off a little bit. But we hear more repeats than we did if the coefficient value is 0. Because as soon as I release the chord, we don't hear any more repeats. It's almost related to or similar to the release parameter in the direct preparation. If we turn up the release time to 721, the note takes longer to decay. Despite the name being release time. But if we set it back to 30 and we play a note, the note takes shorter to decay, or less amount of time to decay. It's the same sort of principle with the feedback coefficient value. Now if we go even higher in value, getting closer to 1, 0.96 for example, we hear a more exaggerated effect and we hear more repeats. So I've already released the chord and we can still hear these repeats. And it sounds like, at that point, it sounded like it wasn't going to stop, and that's because it's getting close to self-oscillation. If we go even higher to 1, or let's say 1.2, it'll start to self-oscillate, and you can hear what that sounds like. Now I had to turn the feedback coefficient value down really quickly because it was getting out of control. It gets very loud, and as you could see in the leftmost meter, where it goes from green to yellow to red, it started peaking in the red and started clipping in either headphones, if you're using headphones, or speakers or anything, but it's clipping the output of bitKlavier. So that's something to watch out for when you're adjusting the feedback coefficient. Usually you don't want to go over 1, and you want to stay a bit under 1. Maybe if you want something to repeat pretty much constantly, set it to about 0.95, 0.96, or if you do want to hear some trailing off and you don't want particular notes or things that you played to feedback or delay forever, keep it around 50, 60 or under. Remember too, you can chain the feedback coefficient and smoothing parameters too, which can make your sounds more complex and unpredictable. Another thing to note is that the beat length also determines when these parameters shift to the next step in the sequencer. You can tell this by looking at the red light or red mark moving from left to right across each parameter row. So just like with the delay length parameter, how we see this red light moving from left to right, the same thing happens with smoothing and with the feedback coefficients, and it's all determined by the time set or the value set in the beat length parameter. So let's start chaining some feedback. And let's say 0.5, 0.7, let's say 0.4 or 5.4, 0.4, and 0.6. Let's do one more, and 0.8. And then for smoothing, let's do only a few. Let's do let's do 200, 2000, and 1500. And we see that if one of the parameters has less steps programmed to the sequencer than the other parameters, they won't move in parallel with one another. So as you see with the delay length parameter and the smoothing parameter, the red lights aren't necessarily in sync. They're in sync in time, but not in position on the sequencer. And that's because the smoothing parameter has less steps than the delay length parameter. And with the feedback coefficient parameter, the reason why that's out of sync with the delay length parameter, even though they have the same number of steps, is because I entered the last step a little bit too late. And so the feedback coefficient on its 5th step, it went back to the first one as soon as I was putting in the value for the 6th step, and so it got off with the delay length parameter. But let's play and hear how this sounds. The last thing worth mentioning about the Blendrónic preparation before we wrap things up is this page that can be accessed using the right arrow to the right side of the screen. Here we see a visual representation of what the delay is doing. This can be super helpful when trying to figure out how the delay is working based on the parameters set. If we play a sound, we can see the waveforms moving across the screen as the delay captures the audio. The purple playhead, which is this vertical line here, is moving back and forth to different parts of the waveform depending on what the different parameters are set to. The purple graph toward the bottom of the display is representing the different delay length values, and the distance between each shift is determined by the beat length values. We also see this buffer length parameter up here towards the right side of the screen. This parameter controls the maximum delay Blendrónic can handle. Right now, the buffer length is higher than any of the specified delay lengths set on the previous page, but if we set the buffer length lower than the delay length values, we can get some pretty unique textures. So let's do that real quick. Instead of 5 seconds, let's go back and check our delay length values, and we see 2 right here. Okay, and just to note, for the beat length values and the delay length values, instead of being measured in milliseconds, they're measured as a coefficient in relation to the tempo. So if the tempo of the piece or that you set in bitKlavier is 120, that means that each beat, each quarter note is 500 milliseconds. And so if the value of the delay length on the first step, for example, it's 2, then that means that the delay length is set to 1000 milliseconds. And then for the second step, it's 1, so the delay length would be 500 milliseconds, and so on and so forth. So we have 1000 milliseconds right here, 500 milliseconds right here, and so on and so forth. And the lowest one looks to be about, what would that be, 100 milliseconds. So let's go here. Let's just go really low, 0.001. Quick note before we start messing with the buffer length parameter. I set the buffer length parameter earlier to 0.01, and bitKlavier did not like this. So make sure that you set your buffer length to a reasonable value. For the most part, you want it higher than any of the delay length values that you're going to be using. But if you want to experiment, set it no less than 1 or even, let's say, 1.5. Wait, let's turn up the feedback and the smoothing. Okay, they're set well. Let's try that one more time. Let's set it even lower. Maybe let's try 0.01. We see Bléndronic doesn't like that so much either, but you can get some pretty cool textures and pretty cool sounds by setting the buffer length less than the delay value. Now, this may not be something you can use in live performance, but you can definitely use it, especially within a VST or audio unit context within your DAW. Hopefully, you've now got a good handle on the Blendrónic Preparation's basic capabilities, as well as some insight into how deep things can get within the preparation. It has a lot of possibilities hidden within it that can only really be found by spending time experimenting with it. If you want to hear some more of its possibilities, however, go to the bitKlavier folder that came with the software and locate the folder named Music. Inside this folder, you'll find sheet music written for the Blendrónic Preparation, entitled Machines for Listening, both for the 49-key keyboards and 88-key keyboards. Playing this music is also a great way to get you started experimenting with a Blendrónic preparation, as it encourages you to listen to some of the different things it's capable of. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope it was helpful for you, and thank you for watching.